is Tyler Shipley. Tyler Shipley completed his PhD at York University and currently teaches economics and political science at Humber College. Then we have Judy Deutsch, who used to teach climate justice at U of T as a visiting lecturer. She was past president of Science for Peace, a member of the Canadian Dimension Editorial Collective, an active participant in Independent Jewish Voices, and she's also a psychoanalyst. Sabah, who will be speaking next, but he's on the end of the table. Born in Basra, Iraq, teaches Middle East politics in the political science department at York University. His research and teaching cover various topics in Marxist political economy, Marxist state theory, theory of regulation, and Middle East politics and economy. And Sardar Saadi is a PhD student in social and cultural anthropology at the University of Toronto. He is engaged in migrant justice, anti-capitalist, and solidarity activism. He is a member of the Rojava Solidarity Collective and is the project coordinator of the Rojava Media Project, which the photos are still up from a project that they did here. And with that, I will hand it over to the speakers, starting with Tyler.
Thanks, Lena. Thank you all very much for being here. I'll see if I can get this thing close enough. I've already taught for 3 hours today, so my vocal cords are warmed up. If I have to just shout, I can do that. I certainly have some practice. So I will, I think, try to very briefly give a kind of an overview, a sort of a backgrounder to what I think is going to come next, which I think in many ways is the part I'm most interested in. So I'm going to sort of try to just kind of front load a bit of background here on Canadian imperialism, on the development of a Canadian imperial foreign policy, how that has come about, how that manifests itself today, and what that's doing to Canadian culture as well. Most of us are probably more or less embedded in the sort of Canadian political culture around us, and have probably noticed the extent to which it's become very aggressively militarized, really, over the past decade. It's ubiquitous, the kind of military stuff that is being pumped through the Canadian cultural apparatus. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, if I have time at the end, and the way that that fits into reshaping Canadian foreign policy. I suppose the best place to start is to very, very briefly, and I can't possibly do this justice in the time I have, but just acknowledge the, I suppose, absurdity of Stephen Harper's statement that Canada has no colonial history. I'm sure that came as absurd to you as it did to me when he said that. And of course, it speaks to a sort of a comical way in which the Harper government currently justifies its colonial policies abroad by claiming that it has no colonial history, which is, of course, incorrect in just about every possible way. Clearly, the project that created Canada was a colonial project. The direct theft of Indigenous territory, often by violent force, dispossession of Indigenous territory through the use of deeply problematic treaty process, which all of you probably know quite well, the destruction of Indigenous culture. And of course, by culture, I don't mean the sort of tokenistic things that Canada celebrates at the Vancouver Olympics. I mean culture in the very real sense, as a way of life, a way of organizing society, politically, economically, socially. The ways that Indigenous people lived were actively undermined and we could say destroyed, if not for the fact that Indigenous people have continued to resist. Certainly the goal of the Canadian state was to destroy Indigenous culture, which is a hallmark of colonialism. Obvious signposts for this claim would include the banning of the potlatch, right, an Indigenous economic and social and cultural ceremony practice in which economic wealth was redistributed between communities. Obviously is a direct contradiction with the capitalist colonial project that Canada had. So one of the first laws passed by the new Canadian government when it became a Canadian government was to ban the potlatch. Residential schools, of course, is another obvious example of the attempt by the Canadian state to truly destroy Indigenous culture in a very colonial project. There are many others. Obviously, the Indian Act, which was a very clear legal structure of apartheid, one that was emulated in other apartheid systems, most notably, I think, Adolf Hitler, who was a great admirer of Canadian policy towards Indigenous people. We could go on and on about this, but I trust that a lot of us in this room know this history quite well. And I will close on this point simply by noting that this colonial project is ongoing. This is not a colonial project of the past, it is one of the present. And the struggles over oil and gas, mining, other industries that are trying to encroach on what's left of Indigenous territory is an obvious sort of marker of that ongoing colonial conflict. Okay, my second point, the second place that I want to go here is to ask the question, is Canada independent? And I ask that because in order to make the claim that Canada is an imperialist power, which is a claim that I will make, we have to agree in the first instance that Canada has independence, that Canada has the capacity to be its own independent colonial power. I don't think this should be controversial, but it is, because broad sections of certainly the Canadian mainstream and indeed parts of the Canadian left have for a very long time been invested in the idea that Canada is a dependency of the United States, that the US is the imperial power, and we're just sort of being pulled along behind. That to a certain extent we don't even have agency, that the Canadian state is not an agent of imperialism, it's a victim of it. I think that particular piece of the argument is a real stretch, but certainly I think there are reasons, legitimate reasons, why people have argued that Canada holds the bully's coat. This is the line that Linda McQuaig in particular has used to describe Canada's foreign policy. We sort of just hold the coat for the bully while the bully goes out and bullies. A couple of points I want to make about this. I think the first is just to say that if this is the case, we should at least acknowledge first that this has been going, we've been holding the coat for a really, really long time. We've been holding the coat as far back as 1918 when Canada invaded Russia to try to defeat the workers' revolution that had pulled Russia out of the First World War. We sent troops to Siberia. A lot of people don't know that. China in the 1930s and 40s, Canada was a strong supporter of the Japanese fascist occupation of China. Politically and diplomatically, Canada made statements in support of the Japanese fascist project in Manchuria, and then in 1937 in the attack on Nanjing. And indeed, Canada sent gunboats to the waters off of China in support of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists after the war, during the Civil War in China, with the United States, of course. Chile in the 1970s, again, one obvious signpost example, when Chileans democratically elected Salvador Allende, a socialist, in 1970, Canada, under the Trudeau government, immediately cut off all aid and began treating Chile as a pariah state. That policy stance was maintained throughout Allende's government, but in 1973, when Allende was assassinated and overthrown in a plot orchestrated by the CIA, Canada immediately, almost immediately, within weeks of Pinochet's rise to power, Canada recognized the Pinochet government and restarted its aid program. In fact, ending up spending hundreds of millions of dollars in aid and loans to Chile, to Pinochet, in part to fund his apparatus of repression. So Canada has been holding the bully's coat for a long time. This isn't new. What I think is new, what I think needs to be added to the story, is that Canada has always had a fair bit of independence in this process. Canada hasn't been simply towing the line that the US has told it to tow. In fact, Canada has often been the prime mover of relations, foreign relations between Canada and the United States. To give you an example, NATO, the NATO alliance, which according to the left nationalist thesis would look like a case where Canada was roped into following the US line. Well, actually, Canada pushed NATO. Canada was the idea came from Canada, it was pushed by Canada, and it was the US that actually acquiesced to the creation of NATO. That's one example. There are several. I feel like I'm probably spending too much time on this point, so I'll move on. But I do want to close this point by saying that today in particular, it's very clear that Canada has policy independence. Canada has a concentrated capitalist class within Canada. A couple of figures that would be of note here. The 250 largest Canadian corporations have on their boards of directors less than 500 individuals, people who sit on multiple boards of multiple corporations. That is an incredible level of concentration in the Canadian capitalist class. It's actually more concentrated than the American capitalist class, which means that the Canadian capitalist class it has some coherence. It is able to put forward a coherent position and a particular kind of pressure on the Canadian state. I'm making this point simply to respond to those who would say Canada has no independence because it's owned by Americans, because assets in Canada are all owned by American firms. And this simply isn't the case. In fact, Canada owns more assets outside of Canada. Canadian companies own more assets outside of Canada than other foreign companies own assets within Canada. To sort of further this point, Canada is now the 9th highest source of foreign direct investment in the world. We are exporting capital, not importing it. I hope I haven't skated over this too quickly, but the point I'm trying to make here is that the Canadian capitalist class is consolidated. It is Canadian, it is uniquely Canadian, and it applies a particular pressure on the Canadian state to pursue Canadian interests, not simply to follow whatever the line is from Washington. With that in mind, I want to talk now a little bit about the contemporary Canadian imperial project and what it looks like and how it is manifest and where it is manifest. And obviously some of this will come up from the other speakers, in particular with Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't want to exaggerate the legacy of peacekeeping, the mythology of peacekeeping, because it is an exaggeration. The extent to which Canada has been a peacekeeping nation, the extent to which that has been Canada's foreign policy is exaggerated in a variety of ways. I do think it's important to distinguish between that moment and this moment being one where peacekeeping has been really knocked off the agenda entirely, if it ever was. And again, I think, I would probably, if I had more time, I would probably want to argue that it's a bit exaggerated. But needless to say, in this moment, it's very clear that peacekeeping is off the agenda. Even when Canada was involved in peacekeeping, I want to just make one point about that, which is that there was always, at the heart of even the peacekeeping project, there was always a kind of colonial logic at work. And I would point to the Somalia affair in particular as an example of this in 1993, when Canadian soldiers, over 80 members of the Canadian forces were involved and implicated in the torture and abuse and murder of the Somalis, some of the Somalis that they were ostensibly there to protect. And I think the language of protect is problematic, but that's kind of the point in a way. There was always a kind of logic that Canadians were better. Canadians were more civilized. They were there to help these poor backwards people. And so, in a sense, it shouldn't be surprising that under particular circumstances, that led to this kind of absurd level of violence that these Canadian soldiers could possibly have thought it would be okay to behave in the way they did, has to speak to the fact that the people they were supposedly protecting had been to a certain extent dehumanized in their mind. This is essential to the logic of colonialism. It was essential in the construction of Canada in the first place in that colonial project, just as it is essential in Afghanistan, in Iraq, it was in Somalia, and so on. Yeah, there's a few other things I want to say about that, but I'm conscious that I'm probably, three minutes is, this is always how it goes, right? Okay, in 3 minutes, let me just put a few places on the map for you as key markers of where Canada has become an aggressive, direct military imperialist power in the contemporary world. Clearly Afghanistan, the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, obvious example. The overthrow of a democratically elected government in Haiti in 2004, following 10 years of military interventions, and then followed by an ongoing military presence in Haiti. I would argue Honduras and the support for the military coup in 2009 was a very direct manifestation of Canadian imperialism. Certainly Libya in 2011, Mali in 2013, and of course now Iraq in 2014. There are many things to say about this. I'll make this one point. in explaining why Canada is an imperialist power today, I think there are two things, maybe three, that are really at the center of this that I want to maybe get out before my time runs out. The first is that clearly there is direct material interest that Canada has in imperialism. Canadian troops are in Haiti in part to support Gildan, a garment manufacturing company that takes advantage of very cheap labor in Haiti. And the government of Jean-Bertrand Aristide was in the process of enacting limited social reforms that would have affected the profits of Canadian corporations. That pattern repeats itself in almost every single one of these cases. The other pattern that you see is Canadian participation in U.S. imperialism. And that is not a contradiction from what I said earlier about Canada having policy independence. I would argue Canada does have policy independence, and it uses that independence to make the decision to join U.S. empire, to align itself with the projects of U.S. imperialism, and thus position Canadian capital to benefit from projects of U.S. empire. Afghanistan, Iraq are perfect examples. Canada's participation, its support for those projects has meant that Canadian corporations have been receiving contracts in the sort of neoliberal dismantling of those places. Afghanistan, you could point to the example of, what's that company? It's a gold mining company at Kilo something, I forget the name of it. Kilo Gold Mines, a Canadian corporation that was awarded a huge contract in Afghanistan after the Karzai government was set up. So those are the two, I think, major manifestations or the major reasons, the motivations for the new Canadian imperialism, which obviously I could explain in more detail maybe later or at another time. I probably have about a minute or so. With that last minute, I would like to just close on the idea of Canada as a warrior nation. The idea that Canada is being rebranded, that it is being repackaged and resold to us, those of us who live in Canada, as a state that we should identify as a warrior state. Not a peacekeeping state, but a warrior state. A state that has a strong, powerful, aggressive military that we should be proud of, that we should consider our heroes. The Highway of Heroes, of course, is a primary example of this. I'm a hockey fan, and so I'm constantly inundated with Don Cherry, whose segments, which used to be really bad analysis of hockey, aren't even that anymore. It's just really bad analysis of geopolitics, with a lot of sort of incoherent hammering of the desk, that always comes back to how great the Canadian military is. The Canadian military is constantly being featured at actual hockey games. They rappel down from the rafters to show us how cool the military is. It's just super, super neat. They play heavy metal music, and these guys come down, and sometimes women, to show that we're a very enlightened colonial military because we have women in it. Deeply, deeply problematic, this sort of campaign to rebrand Canada. And it is ubiquitous. I've given a few examples, but I think another one that we are going to notice in particular over the next few years, we've got a little bit of it, a little sneak preview this month, is the commemoration of World War I. And the establishment of Vimy Ridge as this moment, this birth of the nation, when in reality it was an insignificant battle in a stupid colonial war where working people were sent to die on behalf of empires they had no connection to. And in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, Canadian soldiers came back as anti-war activists. They came back as pacifists. They painted, one of the members of the group of 7 painted incredible pictures of the brutality and stupidity of the war that the Canadian state is now selling back to us as this heroic moment in which Canada was born, in which the true heroes were the warriors, not the peacekeepers, and certainly not the activists, certainly not the trade unionists, or anyone else who resisted projects of Canadian colonialism. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much, and of course I'll talk about stuff later.
Hello, can you hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay. So I also wanted to thank the Center for Social Justice for asking me to speak and also to co-organize this, or to co-sponsor it with him. So I just want to say one other thing in terms of introducing myself, which I'm from the United States. Growing up during the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights era, so I come with it was also a period of a lot of critical history. I'm also quite familiar with the critical work with critical history of Israel-Palestine conflict, and I think that kind of critical history is just coming to Canada and probably is not as well known probably to the Canadian public. Anyway, so I come with a lot of skepticism about I guess the representations about Canada's peacekeeping, tolerant society and so on. So I just wanted to start. I wasn't quite sure what to focus on, so I divided up my talk into 3 parts. One is looking at, again, the bigger global picture. Second, on some specific things about Canada. And thirdly, I was going to talk about Iraq, particularly some of the history that I find is left out of so much of the discussion and presentations about Iraq. But I got a letter into the Star this morning, and it's very concise, so I thought I'd start with that because it does raise some of the main points that I want to raise. It was a response to an article in the Star. They had cited the work of Robert Pate, who did a lot of work on suicide terrorism. What they didn't mention was the key thing that Robert Pate had talked about, which is occupation. So that I talked about that. I said that the article left out the fact that he had pinpointed occupation as a principal cause of suicide terrorism, and that when occupations ended, so did suicide terrorism. I said that it is imperative that the Iraq wars of 1991 and 2003 are also seen as occupations. There was the UN-imposed sanctions regime of 12 years, killing more than 1.5 million children. In the subsequent war, the U.S. promoted sectarian divisions, and Bremer's Order 39 put into place a neoliberal regime that privatized state enterprises. 20 state companies were privatized. It decreed that foreign firms could retain 100% ownership of Iraqi banks, mines, and factories, and it allowed the firms to move 100% of their profits out of Iraq. It allowed for no preferential treatment of local businesses, unrestricted tax-free remittance of all profits, and a 40-year ownership licenses. Halliburton and Bechtel were not required to hire Iraqis or to reinvest their money in the Iraqi economy. In every way, there was the intent to destroy a people and a state. So here I want to start off just with talking about the general global situation, which I think is incredibly dangerous now, that there's the 2 threats of climate change and nuclear war, and that Canada is a threat very much in both of these areas, that Harper in particular, and the Harper government, has been very provocative both in the Middle East and certainly now with Ukraine, and people like Gorbachev are now talking about another Cold War. Just in terms of framing, I want to quote from Iqbal Ahmad, who was writing about Edward Said. He said, "I think that the greatest singular achievement of Said as a literary critic, beginning with Orientalism, has been to put imperialism at the center of Western civilization. What you find in both historical, political literature and literary works in the West in the last 400 years is a great emphasis on the role of enlightenment in the making of civilization and its discourse." Chomsky talks about, in one of his works, he talks about John Stuart Mill, also who's certainly very much connected with liberty and liberalism. And he points out that John Stuart Mill, who was one of the most outstanding Western intellectuals, wrote the classic essay on humanitarian intervention, arguing that Britain is unique in the world, that the British act only for the benefit of others, for natives and barbarians. In the midst of the British suppression of the Indian Mutiny, with British extreme violence and brutality, he wrote of Britain as an angelic power. And I would argue that the Britain liberalism, certainly the position of France now, but the countries that come out of the British Commonwealth have been some of the most obstructive and destructive countries. They've all been the last to sign the conventions on indigenous rights, people's rights in the UN. And Canada, coming to focus specifically on Canada, has also refused to participate in the World Conference on Racism. So, I wanted to speak a bit about Canada. I guess in the one of the things that has been revealed recently is Canada's $14 billion arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia provides arms to the to many of the terrorist groups in the Middle East. So this is again quite central is the hypocrisy of Canada. I think it's important to remember that much of this is silence and going back to Prince Harper proroguing Parliament so that there wasn't just at the point when Parliament was supposed to investigate the torture of prisoners that Canada had handed over to Afghanistan. Matthew Behrens, in a recent article, actually I think it was yesterday or the day before, talked about Ottawa refusing to release the cost of its overseas adventures, both in Ukraine, Iraq, and Syria. He pointed out that the commander there, Daniel Constable, had said that Canada's according to the latest figures, has already flown 100 sorties in Iraq and has delivered close to 1 million pounds of jet fuel. And this commander said that Canada will be killing civilians, but just not at an unreasonable level. And Matthew Behrens pointed out that the media didn't even challenge that to ask, what is meant by an unreasonable level of killing. Also, again, one thing that comes to mind for me recently in terms of the image versus reality of Canada is its refugee policy. That Canada was the government had pledged to take in only 200 Syrian refugees, and so far I don't think anyone has been admitted. But Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey have taken in, millions of people. Lebanon has taken in over 1,140,000 refugees, which amounts to about 1/4 of its population. And these countries are presented as being primitive and with the framing of the clash of civilizations and so on. Another thing that I just found out about too is that over last weekend there was something called the Halifax International Security Forum, which I think shows what what people are focusing on at these levels in Canada. This is a forum that was partnered between NATO, the Department of National Defense here, Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, and the Canadian Commercial Corporation and Lockheed Martin were the sponsors of this forum. And the people who were there included John Baird, Peter MacKay, and Janice Grostein from the Monk School. The topics included pipeline corridors, food, energy, and water, which amongst the neoliberal framing now is really focusing on another green revolution, primarily GMOs, China's creeping mission, and the Japanese-Korean Strategic Cooperation Alliance. And again, looking at the global picture, I think it's very concerning that Russia and China are being encircled. So that this is the lineup. Like, we'll focus on the Middle East tonight, but this is a very alarming lineup. And Chomsky also talks about now the fact that the framing around war has shifted from preemptive war to something that the United States calls preventive war, which the United States is using to claim the right to intervene when there's no threat actually at all, just in order to prevent another war. 3 minutes, my goodness. Okay, so I'm just going to touch on the topics. I was going to talk about the work of Richard Sanders from the Coalition Opposed to the Arms Trade, showing that Canada has actually been a participant in many of the wars that we say that we're not involved in, certainly in Iraq in 2003. That one of the main commanders in that war, who was his name was Natinchik, and he was also just made head of the Canadian Space Agency, which again is a signal that Canada is admitting that it has long participated in ballistic missile defense. The Canadian Space Agency isn't just focused on science, it's focused on missile defense. I was also going to talk about some of the work of Eve Engler, again showing the long-term participation of Canada in many imperial adventures, both through its mining companies as well as revising the laws in many countries. Honduras comes to mind right before the coup against Zelaya there. So I'm just going through this quickly. We can come back to some of this. Canada is also, it's very reactionary foreign policy is very well evidenced in its position with regard to Israel, its refusal to approve of a ceasefire agreement on the UN Human Rights Council during Cass-led, its refusal to admit the Goldstone report, and many other instances. And I would like to talk a little bit about the sanctions regime and the 1991 war in Iraq. Because those are, again, in talking about Iraq, it's often not acknowledged, the kind of devastation and destruction, as well as the United States' long-term support of Saddam Hussein since the overthrow, since the ascendancy of the Ba'ath Party in 1968, and then when Saddam Hussein became the head of the nation in 1979, that there was a very lucrative arms trade, that the United States continued to provide arms, chemical weapons, and even the makings for making nuclear weapons, all the way through until 1991. And Hussein was never censured, say by Rumsfeld, during the time that he was committing chemical warfare against the Kurds and the soldiers in Iran. That there was a lot of double crossing, like the United States promising to protect Shia right after the 1991 war, and they backed out, so that many Shia were slaughtered. The sanctions regime went on for 12 years. This was under the UN Security Council, and it's just like an utter disgrace. Again, like 500 million children, or 500,000 children had died. I have 1 minute. Two of the people who had headed that program quit out of just really disgust, and they blame many levels. They blame the Arab League, certainly principally the UN Security Council, the bureaucracy. He points out particularly von Spanik, Louise Frechette, who's Canadian, who seemed utterly indifferent to the plight of the humanitarian plight. during the sanctions regime and subsequently in the 2003 war, what was so disturbing was the not allowing the Iraqis the basic necessities of life. You know, the infrastructure was destroyed. Hospitals, ambulances, schools were targeted. Unconventional weapons were used by the United States. The situation in Fallujah was very much like the situation in Gaza, in the various sieges of Gaza. So, anyway, my time is up. I hope maybe in the discussion I can talk about the recommendations made particularly by Phyllis Bennis about how to resolve the issues in both Iraq as well as in Syria. And I was also going to quote, since I'm the only woman here on this panel speaking, that I was also wanted to quote, which I hope to later, some words by Nurit Peled Elhanan, really about just the awfulness of war and to parents and to children, youth all over the world. So.
Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you for the invitation. I thank the organizer. I would like to go back a few years, for approximately 20 or 19 to be accurate. I was in Germany, in Frankfurt, studying. At that time, I was working and writing for a left journal, the Links, which means in German left, which is the journal of the students' movement in Germany. And I made 3 points at that time, and these maybe one of the few that I will not take back, and I never regret. The first one is this, I was arguing that the new world order is nothing but a new war order. And the reason why, because, you see, in 1990, 1991, when the US attacked Iraq, under the big lie of liberating Kuwait, and we know how it started. It was like by PR scenario about the Iraqi soldiers killing kids, etc. It was a lie. And by the way, everywhere, every war starts with a lie. Now we have ISIS. Well, I'll come back to this. So one bloody scenario of the war was in March 1991, when the Iraqi army was withdrawn from Kuwait. And I come from the city of Basra, which is almost 1.5 hours from Kuwait. So there's a highway. The Iraqi army, these soldiers were withdrawn from Kuwait. They surrendered, actually. But the US still attacked these poor soldiers. And I'm saying poor because they were neither Baptists nor some kind of Republican or Polish Guard. Pure working class conscripts. They have nothing to do neither with Saddam Hussein nor with the occupation. So almost 100 to 150,000 of them were massacred on the way between Kuwait and Basra. And one of my friends in Kuwait, he was in the Kuwaiti opposition. They do have opposition, by the way, in the Gulf monarchy. So it's not like all of them are an Apple iPhone fanatic or something. So he said he went to the highway to see what happens. And then he saw more boots on the ground, literally boots on the ground, not the soldier, Obama's boot on the ground, but black boots on the ground, more than bodies. So he asked the American officer why there are more boots than people. He said, well, we used some weapons, which is uranium-enriched bomb, which literally melt the body of the people. So they utilized the surrender of the Iraqi army and the withdrawal from Kuwait to test these new uranium-enriched bombs. That was this bloody scenario was an indicator for me that we are witnessing now a new world order. The second movement in this new world order was the ideological one, the doctrine of the so-called clash of civilization. What we witnessed at that time, and we witness it today, is the ethno-sectarianization of conflict. In Iraq, when the US pretended to protect the Kurds and the Shiite, de facto the message was that the regime was Sunni and the Shiite and the Kurds are victims of the regime. Here you go. You fracture the country along ethno-sectarian line. You can see this in Rwanda with the Tutsis and Hutu. You can see this in ex-Yugoslavia. And it was so funny, I remember one of the panels in Germany on the German TV during the Yugoslavia war. And one of the good liberal commentator was saying, we are witnessing an ethnic conflict between the Croat, the Serb, and the Muslim. And I went, well, since when Muslim is an ethnic category? So anything goes. The main thing is something ethnic, something sectarian. We can see this also in Afghanistan, by the way, when we talk about the Baluchistan and the Taliban and the what have you. And you can see it again in Iraq in 2003, and in Libya in 2011, and in Syria in 2012-13. So you have the whole line of the New World Order. The second moment I made at that time was that the 1917, the October Revolution, did not put an end, but it pushed back against the imperialist adventure at that time. And it took almost 80 years for imperialist power to continue their old imperialist project, which was stopped partly by the October Revolution and by the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle in the so-called Third World. So what we're witnessing since the 90s is a déjà vu with the old imperialist project, but in new form. And of course, this comeback is enabled by two moments: the breakdown of the Soviet Union, but most importantly, the defeat of the working class in Europe, North America, and so on, and the left in general. It enabled this new liberal imperialist project to occupy the rest of the world. So what we're witnessing since the beginning of the 90s is the conscious and deliberate failing of state, not failed state. You have a very prominent, intelligent person here in Toronto, Ignatieff, right? Telling us stories in the 90s about the new war, right? Some kind of group of school groups and militias and, well, yeah, true. New wars, but the new wars are the imperialist wars, not the militias, not these groups. And these groups, be them Al-Qaeda to ISIS, you will see, are the construction of this war scenario. They fulfill specific agendas in this war scenario. They are not coincidental. So the new wars are designed, executed by imperialist power. But again, just like neoliberalism, so too imperialism, it doesn't just penetrate if it's not invited. You need to invite imperialism. You need to invite neoliberalism. That means you need to find collaborators from within to pursue such imperialist or whatever neoliberal agenda. So, well, I have 5 pages actually. I don't think I'll be able even to read one of them. So what I will do, instead of going, instead of reading my paper, I will just give some maybe food for thought about Iceland and the current war scenario. But I would like to start with something. One of the best anti-war novel I read 10 years ago is from a Nigerian civil rights activist who was murdered at the end of the 90s by the military junta in collaboration with the Shell Oil Corporation. After Shell destroyed socially, environmentally his community, he was executed. One of his best novels, anti-war novels, is Soldier Boy, written from the perspective of a child soldier, and written also in broken English. He wanted to be as much realist as possible to reflect the experience of this child soldier. So, in one moment, this child soldier was observing politicians, media, sweet talkers, and so on. They talk about big things. So he was saying, big words and grammar plenty. Now so, trouble plenty. And as trouble plenty, now so plenty people were dying. So I learned from Sardar Boy, whenever I hear our values, democracy, humanitarian intervention, I become nervous. Because that means many people were dying. And this is exactly the scenario Kinsara Riwa was talking about in Sardar Boy. So 3 moments to understand the current situation, I think 3 moments. Again, 1991, the destruction of Iraq at that time and fracturing the country along ethno-sectarian lines. The second moment is 2003, the occupation of Iraq and the destruction of the state institution, of the economy, etc., dismantling all institutionalized relation of power and introducing a regime of occupation. By the way, similar to the Israeli regime of occupation in Palestine, right? You institutionalize some collaborator to govern for you with iron fist. And I was arguing that this form of the state is nothing but terror institutionalized as government, a form of political control. So terror comes from the middle of the states. You see, from Robespierre to Obama and Baghdadi, terror is an act of the state. For only the state can claim legitimate monopoly on the use of violence, legitimate or otherwise. Right? One of our students a few weeks ago sent me an email. He said, Sabah, we need to talk about something. And he sits here, just in Paris. He was telling you, why on earth ISIS or ISIL want to be territorialized? I think it's a good question. I'll come to this in a minute. So what happened after 2003? A new constitution, a new election laws, a new security apparatus, etc., were designed by the US. And the parties that collaborated with the US, the Shiite party, and part of the Kurdish party, not all of them, of course, were the one, and still the one, who control these institutions. So what we witnessed since 2003 is a circulation of political power within the same elite. Those elites create what you can call a war provocateur, a clientelist network of all those who support them within Iraq, accumulated an enormous wealth. A new phenomenon in Iraq, which we didn't have, and I would argue neither in the classical nor modern history of Iraq, 5,000 millionaire and billionaire within 10 years. I was all my life against the Ba'ath regime. I come from a communist family. But I haven't seen a single Ba'athist millionaire in Iraq. I didn't encounter one of them. This was what was institutionalized in Iraq. On the one hand, the two moments of the US strategy in Iraq, shock and awe of Rumsfeld, which is, as I said, nothing but state terror. And the second one is corruption. Within 1 year, when Paul Bremer was in Iraq in 2003 to May 2004, $10.8 billion from Iraqi development fund were gone. He was spending his time for 1 year spending cash on all those who collaborated with the United States. $8.8 billion, think about it. It's a lot. So corruption was institutionalized at the center of the state. War on terror is nothing but war on terror. Third moment, maybe much more significant for the current situation, the Arab Revolution in 2011. Actually December 2010, but okay, 2011. Took everybody by surprise. Not only the revolutionary, but above all, imperialist power. So, imperialist power and their original allies, by the way, not only the Gulf monarchy, but Israel too, they were threatened, and the only way to push back against the Arab Revolution, against people's demand, is to militarize the conflict. Started with Libya, and never in the history of the Security Council since 1945, intervention was so quickly resolved. Within 1 week, the file of Libya landed on the table of the Security Council and decided, right? But if you look at the legitimacy for the Libyan war, it's the Arab League. But if you look at who voted for the Libyan war, 8 of 9 who said yes are monarchies. 6 Gulf monarchies plus Jordan and Morocco. And then the peaceful protests in Syria were also turned bloody by all kind of groups smuggled into Syria from Turkey, Lebanon, and so on, to militarize the conflict, to sectarianize the conflict. This is precisely what happened.
It was the Assad regime who committed war crimes.
That too, yes.
So say it.
Yeah, look.
Some of our
We're gonna,
No.
we're gonna,
Look, hey, you are talking to someone who spent all of his life fighting against the Ba'athists, be it in Syria or Iraq. So stop it. We are talking about 1 million Iraqi killed by the US, not by Assad. So before we go to Syria, many Iraqis were killed. Many Iraqis were
we're gonna
killed
do questions.
by the US and the UK. So what happens in Syria? The Assad regime, of course, is a dictatorship, it's brutal, it's blah, blah, blah. I know this. But we are now going through a new scenario with a new fascist-like group supported, armed by regional power and the United States, the UK and France, massacring people in Syria, in Iraq, in a state of fighting against the US or Israel. That is the reality. And Assad is a dictator and murderer, we know this. We know Saddam Hussein is a murderer and dictator. And Mubarak and Ben Ali, and all of them. That's why people made the revolution. What we are witnessing today is the pushback against the revolutionary demand of the people, militarization and sectarianization of the conflict. This is what's going on. So if you look at it, what do you see? Just last one thing. The bombing campaign of the United States and NATO on regional power, look at it carefully, what do you see? A selective bombing, pointing the road to ISIL, where to go, to Kobani, but not to Kirkuk, to Tikrit, but not to Sulaymaniyah. If you look at it, what do you see? You see a so-called Sunni territory, west of Iraq and east of Syria, in the middle of the so-called Shiite axis, Iran, Iraq, and Syria and Lebanon. This is a clear scenario pushed by the regional power and the United States to perpetuate the conflict. Because the only way the US and imperialist power can exercise, reproduce, and cement their dominance is qua instability, conflict, and escalation, is qua war. That's the new order. Thank you.
Okay, so I will try to be a little bit more hopeful about what's happening. It's really difficult to really be hopeful, and I totally understand the frustration. And I think, okay, let me first start to thank Center for Social Justice and Nana and Bey Zeytun for hosting us here. I think it's very important to have such a discussions here in this environment about the Canadian government's involvement in what's happening in the Middle East, and what we can do here. We have started a group in Toronto, Rojava Solidarity Collective, and the first paragraph that we were talking about our hallmarks, and we agreed that only a critique of imperialism in the Middle East is not enough. Any kind of solidarity work must be must address the situation in the region as well. And what I'm saying about what I mean about the situation that's created, but not only by imperialist powers, but also by authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Like people who are coming from the region, like Dr. Sabah and everyone else, have experienced in so many levels the state violence on behalf of the authoritarian regimes, and the many revolutions that's happening, and that they have been not successful very much. It's just because of the imperialist power. But we also have jihadist groups, and they are a very serious threat to the not only to the political life of the people in the region, but also to the value of life, the whole civilization that we are carrying in each of us. So I think that these three are very important, imperialist power, authoritarian regimes, and jihadist group. And without an analysis of all of them, we can't really provide genuine solidarity. We can't show that with the people. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk about Rojava. I visited the Rojava region in Syria in August 2014. And that when I went to Rojava, I went through Iraq, Erbil. It was the time that ISIS attacked Shangal mountain, Sinjar mountain, and over 100,000 people, Yazidi refugees, 100,000 refugee people were displaced, and many became refugees around the region in Turkey, in Iraq, but mainly in Rojava region. And the main group who provided a safe corridor for these people were YPG forces from Rojava. And these people, they started to get some attention right now after Kobani because of ISIS and because of the image that media is creating of what's happening in Rojava according to their own agenda. But really what's happening there is a genuine social revolution that's spreading all over the Middle East. For Kobani, we had so many protests from Afghanistan, from Iran, in Turkey, in Iraq, and in other countries around the world. So there is a very much separation between what we are hearing from media, from mainstream media about the region and what's happening on the ground. And this multi-ethnic, multi-religious character of the Middle East throughout the history, the modern history, from the time that colonial powers started to exploit this region for the oil, it has been used in many ways. I really wanted to show an image of the situation in Syria right now, but what's happening, but we don't have a PowerPoint, but that's okay. I just want to show where the Rojava region is located in Syria. But also, I just want to mention that the making of the Middle East, that after 1916 Sykes-Picot secret agreement and then Lausanne Treaty, that basically draw the current map of the Middle East, and at that very beginning they ignored the Kurdish people's right for self-determination in those countries. But I also wanted to make this point very clear that this is not about the Kurds. After this border that was made between Syria and Turkey, that's right now a very crucial point in the whole situation in the Middle East, because this is the border that ISIS is using, and with the hope of the Turkish government, and that in my opinion it's not really that much difference in their agenda. It's probably much dangerous in long term, because this is a neoliberal Islam agenda, and with AKP government and the level of violence on the streets after the Gezi resistance, and right now even after the uprisings for Kobani, it's unbelievable, and it's the state committing them, and it's very much legitimized, and yeah, so I feel like I totally agree that ISIS is a scapegoat basically in the whole situation right now. Like everyone is involved in worsening what's happening in the Middle East, and in the current chaos that's that we're following and we're seeing. Anyway, so that border, I want to show an image that after the Sykes-Picot agreement, many cities, many villages, many territories by Kurdish and Arab and Syriani and even Armenian tribes was they were divided between Turkey and Syria, and there are like some cities literally divided in two, like Kamishlu and Nusaybin. There are other cities like Ceylanpınar and Ras Al Ain. City that Kurds call Serekani, which means fountain, and also in Kobani and Afrin. So the whole Rojava region that we know right now was kind of created by that colonial agreement. And after that, after the creation of the state of the Syrian state, as we know, as an entity, many of those Kurdish tribes were forced to go back to Turkey. They were divided, and throughout the 20th century, there was an Arabization and assimilation politics in those regions. Many of the villages were emptied, many displaced, and until 2011, about 300,000 Kurds in Syria, they didn't have any status, actually. And in terms of economic and social and economic situation, it's also very much below the standard of living in Syria before revolution. After 2011, there are like so many examples of the Kurdish uprising in Syria, but after 2011, the whole world know about the reality of the Kurds in Syria, because they were like very much, the population is much smaller from other countries. So the Kurds, I'm sure you all know, there are about 40 million people divided into 4 countries: Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and Syria. The largest part is in Turkey, about 20 to 25 million. In Iran, we have about 7 to 10 millions. In Iraq, about 5 to 7 millions. And in Syria, from 2 to 3 millions. I'm Kurdish from Iran, but I have been studying the Kurdish self-determination movement in Turkey mainly, but right now I'm very much interested in Rojava. So the Kurdish political movement in Syria and Turkey very much is affected by the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is totally different from what we have in Iraq. And the PKK has been criminalized by the whole war, basically, till maybe a couple months ago, because they're fighting a NATO ally, Turkey, and they were, the PKK is in the terrorist list organization of all Western countries, the United States, European Union, Canada, and Turkey's allies in the war. So in Syria, because Öcalan was in Syria, he started first. So Abdullah Öcalan is the leader of the PKK. He's right now imprisoned in Imrali prison in Turkey. He was in Syria, and he very much used that capacity to build his movement and the PKK. So the Kurdish movement, as we know, with the PKK, the political movement was had very strong ties and strong bases in Syria. Coming back to what I was trying to say about 2011, after the civil war, after the revolution in Syria, and that ended up in the situation that we are seeing right now, the main Kurdish political party, Democratic Union Party, PYD, they declared that they are not going to take part in the civil war, and they refused to be part of Free Syrian Army and NATO-supported groups. Also, they also refused to participate in any campaign and any alliance with the Syrian regime. Right now, many Syrian oppositions may not agree with me, and they might say that there are some ties between PYD and the Assad regime, which is not true. And from 2004, that the Qamishli uprising happened, Syrian Kurds, they have been in the front line of the revolution in Syria. But right now, it's much clear that they refuse to take part in any kind of military aggression, and from the beginning of the civil war, they refused any alliance with NATO, and they refused that basically. So from 2011, they started controlling. They started controlling these Kurdish regions, and they divided into 3 cantons, and these 3 cantons, they started to establish their own self-rule and self-administration for kind of autonomous governments. Jazeera Canton, which is very close to Iraq, between Iraq, Turkey, and Kobani Canton, that right now is under attack. It's under siege by both ISIS and Turkey, and also Afrin Canton, that's right now under threat by the other jihadist group, Al-Nusra Front. Yeah. So PYD, in 2013, they started to write a constitutional document called the social contract between all the ethnic and religious group in Rojava. I really wanted to read that, but I'm not sure if I have time. The preamble of the Constitution, I think it's a very important document, and it's for the people who are coming from the region, they know that this is probably the most democratic document that right now it's being practiced on the ground. So I'm just going to read probably 2 paragraphs. We, the people of the Democratic Autonomous regions of Afrin, Jazeera, and Kobani, a confederation of Kurds, Arabs, Syriacs, Armenians, Turkmen, Armenians, and Chechens, freely and solemnly declared and established this charter. In pursuit of freedom, justice, dignity, and democracy, and led by principles of equality and environmental sustainability. The translation is a little bit liberal, so you could say ecological liberation. I'm gonna talk about that later, if I have time. The charter proclaims a new social contract based on mutual and peaceful coexistence and understanding between all strands of society. It protects fundamental human rights and liberties and reaffirms the people's right to self-determination. Anyway, it continues. You can find it if you just Google the Constitution of the Rojava. And so the main ideological base for this constitution was the idea that Abdullah Öcalan developed in Imrali prison. It's called Democratic Confederalism. I brought a couple, couple documents. So this one is Democratic Confederalism. It's a very short handbook. You can find it online. And so Öcalan in 2004 started to read many new books, and working on new ideas, and mainly with anarchist thinkers, and specifically Muray Bookchin. And he wrote many books, like from The Roots of Civilization to Roadmap, his prison writings, and many other works. And he basically rejected the idea of revolution by taking the state, and referred to the state in the Middle East as the main reason of the current chaos. And also he said that capitalism, like there are like so many points about capitalism and capitalist modernity in the Middle East that's not working, and the character of the Middle East is not about the capitalist modernity. And he was mainly promoting the idea of libertarian municipalism, which is Muray Bookchin's idea, and what's that one? The other one called? So gender liberation and libertarian ecology, or ecology of freedom. There are like so many new ideas in the Kurdish political movement. And after local elections in Turkey, actually, the Kurds, they start to implement these ideas in the municipalities. That's actually my, okay, maybe just one more minute. That's my project of research. And in municipalities, they start to work on these ideas. So if I just summarize that in like a few sentences, democratic confederalism is basically a notion of radical democracy that people in the region should organize themselves from below, establishing people's assemblies, and each assembly to have their own power of self-defense. And these assemblies, these communes coming together, forming on different levels, for example, neighborhood assemblies, city assemblies, and further and further. And the umbrella organization is KJK right now, politically. The KJK stands for Kurdistan Union of Societies in Kurdistan. And in Rojava, what I saw was in every neighborhood there were like from 10 to 15 communes. Like for example, in 2 streets, 2 alleys, a few households, they come together, form a commune. They have their own roles, and from these communes they have neighborhood assemblies. From the neighborhood assemblies they have city assemblies, and from city assemblies they have canton assembly. And there are quotas based on the ethnic and religious character of each neighborhood, and there's also 40% quota for women. And in each of them, we met with some of them. the main power is actually the quota is for men. Like they're like we met with a few communes, neighborhood communes. Like one of them, there were like probably 8 women and only a guy. So these assemblies are around the Rojava region. PYD has 2 defense groups, YPG and YPJ. YPG stands for People's Protection Units, and the YPJ is Women's Defense Units. And they also have security forces and civilian security forces in general, and especially for women. And the women one is specifically dealing with domestic violence. And we actually saw like a couple incidents how they beat up the guys. And yeah, I think I'm gonna end that, but in the question answers probably we could have we could talk a little bit more, but that's it.